Rome built an empire on dominance. Conquer. Command. Never submit. That was the code every Roman lived by, and every emperor was expected to embody. Then came a boy who shattered every single rule. He sat on the most powerful throne in the ancient world. He commanded legions that stretched from Britain to Babylon. He had the absolute power of life and death over 60 million people. And he chose to kneel. Not in defeat. Not under threat. By choice. Elagabalus, Emperor of Rome, fell in love with the man who struck him. Hunted him down. Married him publicly. And then told the entire Roman world that he was not the husband. He was the wife. Rome had seen mad emperors. Cruel emperors. Emperors who murdered their own families, burned cities, fed men to lions for sport. But this broke them. Because this wasn't cruelty. It wasn't madness. It was devotion. Obsessive, all-consuming, completely shameless devotion, from the most powerful man alive, to a charioteer who hit him in a back alley and walked away. What follows is not a story about scandal. It's a story about power. About what happens when the person who holds all of it decides they don't want it. And about how Rome answered that decision, with blood. Now stop. Because most people watching this are about to get it completely wrong. When you heard that a Roman emperor married a man, you assumed that was the scandal. It wasn't. Rome was not innocent. Roman men of every class, every rank, every legion had relations with other men. Nobody looked twice. The scandal was never who. It was how. In Rome, one rule governed everything beneath the surface. The dominant role was masculine. Honorable. Expected. The submissive role belonged to women, slaves, and the defeated. Those categories were absolute. An emperor who chose submission, publicly, proudly, without apology, wasn't breaking a rule. He was dismantling the entire idea of what Rome was. And almost everything written about him afterward was written by the people who killed him. Remember that. Because this is not the story of a monster. This is the story of a boy. A teenage priest from Syria who was handed the Roman world at 14 and refused, completely, defiantly, at the cost of his own life, to be what Rome needed him to be. That's the story. And it begins not in Rome. It begins in a temple. Emesa. Syria. Early 3rd century AD. Not Rome. Not the center of the world. Not marble and legions and the weight of empire. A desert city. A sun temple. A boy in priestly robes. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus. He was perhaps 11 years old. And every morning before dawn he climbed the steps of the temple of Elagabalus, the Syrian sun god, dressed in robes of silk and gold, his face painted, his head crowned, and he danced. Not performed. Not presided. Danced. Before the god. Before the sacred black stone that his family had worshipped for generations. This was not a decoration. This was devotion. Total, physical, all-consuming devotion to a deity that demanded everything from its priest, body, identity, self. That matters. Remember it. Because the boy who would one day kneel before a charioteer and call himself a wife, learned what surrender meant first in that temple. Long before Rome ever saw his face. His family was not ordinary. His grandmother was Julia Misa, one of the most politically dangerous women in Roman history. Sister of the former Empress Julia Domna. A woman who had lived inside imperial power long enough to understand exactly how it worked and exactly how to take it. When the Emperor Caracalla was assassinated in 217 AD and a general named Macrinus seized the throne, Julia Misa saw her opening. She had 2 daughters. Each had a son. One of those sons was the boy from the temple. Julia Misa did something calculated and ruthless. She spread a rumor, deliberately, strategically, that her grandson was actually the illegitimate son of the assassinated Emperor Caracalla. That royal blood ran in his veins. It was almost certainly a lie. It worked perfectly. The Roman legions stationed in Syria were loyal to Caracalla's memory. When Julia Misa brought the boy before them, dressed in his full priestly costume, exotic and striking and undeniably compelling, they responded to what they saw. A 14-year-old boy in silk robes standing in torchlight looked, to battle-hardened soldiers, like something sent by the gods. They declared him emperor. Not because of his experience. Not because of his capability. Not because anyone had asked whether a teenage Syrian priest who had spent his entire life dancing before a sun god was remotely prepared to govern 60 million people. Because his grandmother needed a face. And his face was perfect. On June 8, 218 AD, Varius Avitus Bassianus became emperor of Rome. He took the name of his god, Elagabalus. He was 14 years old. He had never seen Rome. He did not speak Latin fluently. He arrived in the capital dressed not in Roman imperial dress but in his priestly robes, silk, gold, painted face, Eastern jewelry, and the city that had conquered the known world stopped and stared. The Senate stared. The Praetorian Guard stared. The Roman public stared. This was their emperor. This boy. This foreign priest. This child who smelled of incense and moved like he was still in the temple. Some were fascinated. Most were horrified. And Elagabalus, 14 years old, installed on the throne of Augustus, surrounded by people who despised everything he was, did not try to adapt. Did not try to become Roman. Did not perform the role they needed him to perform. He doubled down. He brought his God with him. He placed the sacred black stone of Elagabal in a golden chariot and paraded it through the streets of Rome. He demanded that Jupiter, the supreme god of Rome, the divine foundation of imperial power, be demoted. Subordinated. Made second to a Syrian sun deity that most Romans had never heard of. He built a new temple on the Palatine Hill. He transferred Rome's most sacred religious objects into it. He was telling Rome, with complete sincerity, without any apparent awareness of how catastrophically this would land, that everything they believed was now ranked below what he believed. He was 14. And he meant every word of it. This is who Elagabalus was before Hierocles. Before the marriage. Before the scandal. Before the blood. A boy shaped entirely by devotion. By a religion that taught him that the self was something to be offered completely, to the god, to the ritual, to the moment. Rome wanted an emperor who took. It got a priest who gave. And somewhere in the streets of Rome, in the crowd watching that golden chariot roll past, in the chaos of a city that didn't know what had just arrived, a charioteer was watching. His name was Hierocles. And before this story, before any of this, he was nobody. Not a general. Not a senator. Not a man of any rank or consequence in the rigid architecture of Roman society. He was a slave. Born in Curia, a region in what is now southwestern Turkey, sold, traded, passed through hands the way property moves. He ended up in Rome the way thousands of slaves ended up in Rome. Anonymously. Without choice. But Hierocles had something. He could handle horses. Specifically, he could drive a chariot at speeds that made crowds forget to breathe. In Rome, that was worth something. The Circus Maximus held up to 250,000 people. Chariot racing was not a sport. It was a religion. Charioteers were the closest thing Rome had to modern celebrity, adored, obsessed over, bet on, written about on the walls of buildings across the city. A slave who could race was a slave with value. A slave who could win was a slave with power. Hierocles won. The ancient sources are not precise about exactly how Elagabalus and Hierocles first met. What they do tell us is this. Elagabalus saw him race. And something happened in that moment that no imperial dignity, no religious devotion, no political reality could override. The Emperor of Rome became completely undone by a charioteer. The accounts, primarily from the Historia Augusta, describe Elagabalus deliberately engineering an encounter, placing himself in a position where Hierocles would pass close to him, where contact was possible. And in that encounter, Hierocles struck him. Whether by accident or design, the sources do not agree. What they agree on is the aftermath. Elagabalus was not angry. He was electrified. Now pause here. Because this is the moment most people misread. The instinct is to see this as humiliation. An emperor struck by a slave, degraded, embarrassed, diminished. That is not how Elagabalus experienced it. Remember the temple. Remember the boy who learned devotion before he learned anything else. Who was shaped by a religion that understood surrender not as weakness but as the highest possible offering. Who had spent his entire conscious life in service to something larger than himself. For Elagabalus, being struck by Hierocles was not humiliation. It was recognition. In one physical moment of contact, unsanctioned, unscripted, raw, he felt something that the throne had never given him. That the Senate had never given him. That 60 million subjects bowing before him had never given him. He felt real. And he wanted more of it. What followed was not subtle. Elagabalus pursued Hierocles with the full weight of imperial obsession. The slave who had struck the emperor was elevated overnight. Given wealth. Given status. Given access to the palace that senators spent careers trying to obtain. Elagabalus called him husband. Publicly. In the open court of the Roman Empire, before the Senate, before the guard, before anyone who cared to witness it, the Emperor of Rome referred to a Carian slave charioteer as his husband. And then went further. He referred to himself as Hierocles' wife. Not metaphorically. Not privately. Not as some intimate language between two people behind closed doors. As a public declaration of identity. He reportedly petitioned to be called not emperor but empress. Not master but wife. Ancient sources claim he would greet officials while dressed in women's clothing, performing domestic roles, deliberately, theatrically, without any apparent concern for what it meant politically. He wanted Rome to see it. All of it. Now here is where the source problem becomes impossible to ignore. Almost every extreme detail about Elagabalus, the most lurid, the most theatrical, the most shocking, comes from the Historia Augusta. A collection of imperial biographies written decades after his death. By authors whose identities are disputed. With clear political motivations to destroy his legacy. Historians have spent centuries arguing about which parts of the Historia Augusta are documented fact and which parts are elaborated propaganda designed to justify what Rome did to him. The marriage to Hierocles, corroborated by multiple sources. Almost certainly real. The specific details of what happened behind palace doors, far less certain. This matters. Because the most extreme version of this story, the version that gets repeated everywhere, may be partly a portrait painted by his murderers. Not to protect Elagabalus, but to protect ourselves from a more uncomfortable question. What if the extreme version isn't true? What if a teenage boy simply loved someone who wasn't appropriate, and Rome killed him for it, and then spent centuries elaborating the story to make sure nobody ever felt sorry for him? That question has no clean answer. Hold it anyway. What we know without serious dispute is this. Hierocles was not passive in this arrangement. He leveraged his position aggressively. He inserted himself into political decisions. He accepted bribes from people who wanted access to the emperor. He reportedly beat Elagabalus, not once, not privately, and Elagabalus not only tolerated it but according to ancient accounts welcomed it. Boasted about it. Showed the marks as evidence of a real marriage. Hierocles was not a man in love with an emperor. Hierocles was a man who had been given an extraordinary accident of fate and was determined to extract everything from it. And Elagabalus, the boy from the temple, the priest who knew only how to give completely, let him take everything. In the palace, the Roman Empire was still running. Wars were being managed. Provinces were being governed. The vast administrative machinery of the ancient world's largest empire kept turning. But at the center of it, in the rooms where the most powerful person alive was supposed to be making decisions, a teenage boy was writing letters to a charioteer. Calling himself a wife. Showing the bruises. And calling them love. Rome was watching. And Rome was done. Empires do not collapse in a single moment. They erode. Slowly. Quietly. In the gap between what a ruler is and what the people around them need them to be. By 221 AD, 3 years into his reign, that gap had become a chasm. The Senate had endured the religious provocations. They had endured the Eastern robes. The painted face. The Syrian god paraded through Roman streets in a golden chariot. The demotion of Jupiter. The transfer of sacred objects to a temple built for a deity most of them had never heard of before this boy arrived. They had gritted their teeth and endured it. Because emperors were eccentric. History had proven that repeatedly. Eccentricity could be managed. Eccentricity could be worked around. As long as the machinery kept turning, as long as the borders held and the grain shipments arrived and the legions were paid, a strange emperor was survivable. But this was different. This was not eccentricity. This was the emperor of Rome publicly, repeatedly, enthusiastically subordinating himself to a slave. In Roman eyes that was not a personal matter. It was a political catastrophe. Because the emperor was not just a man. He was a symbol. The living embodiment of Roman dominance. The point at which all power converged. Every treaty signed, every war declared, every law enacted, all of it flowed from the authority of that one figure at the top. And that figure was showing the bruises a charioteer had left on him. And smiling. The Praetorian Guard watched. These were the men responsible for the emperor's protection. Elite soldiers. Politically shrewd. Historically dangerous, they had made and unmade emperors before and they knew it. What they saw was not an emperor. What they saw was a liability. A figure so divorced from every Roman conception of power and dignity that his continued presence on the throne was becoming an active threat to the stability of the empire they were sworn to protect. They began to talk. Quietly. Carefully. In the way that men talk when they are deciding something irreversible. Julia Misa saw it first. She always saw things first. The grandmother who had engineered Elagabalus's rise to power, who had spread the lie about his parentage, who had stood him before torchlit legions and watched soldiers declare a child emperor, was watching her investment collapse in real time. She had not placed a boy on the throne of Rome because she loved him. She had placed him there because he was useful. He was no longer useful. He had become dangerous. Not in the way powerful men are dangerous, not through violence or conquest or ruthless political calculation. Dangerous in the way a structural crack is dangerous. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just present. Spreading. Undermining everything built on top of it. Julia Misa made a decision. She had another grandson. His name was Alexianus. He was younger than Elagabalus. Quieter. More conventionally Roman in every way that mattered to the people whose support she needed. She began maneuvering him into position. She approached Elagabalus carefully. Adopt Alexianus, she told him. Make him Caesar. Give him a title. A role. Something that signals stability to the Senate and the Guard. It was framed as political strategy. It was actually a succession plan. Elagabalus, distracted, devoted, spending his days in a palace with a charioteer who beat him and called it marriage, agreed. Alexianus was renamed Alexander Severus and declared Caesar in 221 AD. Almost immediately, Elagabalus regretted it. The moment Alexander Severus was elevated, the dynamic shifted. The Senate responded to him the way they had never responded to Elagabalus. With relief. With visible, undisguised relief that there was someone, anyone, in the imperial family who looked and behaved like a Roman ruler was supposed to look and behave. The guard responded the same way. Elagabalus saw it happening and understood what it meant. He tried to reverse it. He attempted to strip Alexander of his title. To have him removed. Ancient sources suggest he may have gone further, that he considered having his cousin killed before the situation moved beyond his control. He ordered the guard to give up Alexander. The guard refused. That refusal was the moment everything ended. Not the marriage. Not the religious provocations. Not the years of accumulated outrage and barely suppressed contempt. The moment the Praetorian Guard looked at the Emperor of Rome and said no, that was the moment Elagabalus was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. He was 18 years old. He had been emperor for 4 years. He was still writing letters to Hierocles. Still calling himself a wife. Still, in whatever private world he had constructed inside the palace walls, devoted. Completely. To a man who had never deserved it. To a god who demanded everything. To an idea of love that Rome had decided it could not afford to let survive. Outside those walls, in the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, the decision had already been made. March 11, 222 AD. The guard moved. They found him hiding. The most powerful man in the ancient world, the Emperor of Rome, the High Priest of Elagabalus, the boy from the Syrian temple who had danced before a black stone at dawn and believed completely in the things he could not explain, was found hiding. Some accounts say he was concealed in a chest. Trying to disappear. Trying to become small enough that the world would stop demanding things from him. They killed him there. They killed his mother Soaemias beside him. She had stayed. She did not run. And then Rome did what Rome did to the people it needed to erase. They dragged his body through the streets. They threw it in the Tiber. The Senate issued a formal condemnation, damnatio memoriae. His name was to be struck from monuments. From records. From memory. Rome did not just kill Elagabalus. Rome tried to make him never have existed. He was 18 years old. Read that again. 18. Hierocles vanished from the historical record entirely after the assassination. No execution documented. No exile recorded. No final account of what became of the man who had struck an emperor and been handed the world in return. He simply disappears. The way opportunists disappear when the opportunity runs out. The boy who loved him completely, who had offered everything, who had knelt before a charioteer the way he had once knelt before a god, was in the river. And Hierocles was already gone. That is what the history books record. But history books are written by the survivors. And the survivors of this story had every reason to make sure you remembered the monster. And forgot the boy. History made its verdict on Elagabalus very quickly. Deviant. Disgrace. The worst emperor Rome ever produced. That verdict has lasted 1800 years. And it was written, almost entirely, by the people who killed him, the people who benefited from his death, and the people who needed Rome to believe he deserved it. Think about that. Rome gave us Caligula. An emperor who reportedly made his horse a consul. Who murdered for entertainment. Who humiliated senators by forcing their wives into prostitution. Who executed people not for what they did but for what he felt like on a given morning. Rome gave us Nero. Who burned Christians as human torches to light his garden parties. Who executed his own mother. Who kicked his pregnant wife to death. Rome gave us Domitian. Who had senators executed based on dreams. Who demanded to be addressed as a god while he was still alive. Who turned paranoia into policy and made fear the primary instrument of governance. These men are remembered as monsters. But they are also remembered as emperors. Their coins still circulate in museums. Their names appear in history books without asterisks. Scholars debate their policies. Documentaries examine their psychology. They are studied. Elagabalus was erased. Ask yourself why. Caligula murdered. Nero murdered. Domitian murdered. Elagabalus, by the standards of Roman imperial history, was not a uniquely violent emperor. The body count attributed to him is modest compared to what Rome considered acceptable from its rulers. His crimes, the ones that actually destroyed him, were crimes of identity. He wore the wrong clothes. He worshipped the wrong god. He loved the wrong person in the wrong way. He refused to perform dominance when the entire system demanded it from him. And Rome, which had survived genuine monsters, could not survive that. The Historia Augusta calls him every name available in the Latin language for depravity. But buried inside those same accounts, underneath the outrage, underneath the propaganda, underneath 18 centuries of people repeating what his murderers wrote about him, is a portrait of a boy who was never asked what he wanted. Who was placed on a throne at 14 by a grandmother who needed a face. Who brought his God with him because his God was the only thing that was actually his. Who found, in a charioteer who struck him once and walked away, something that felt, for the first time, like it wasn't being managed or performed or politically calculated. Something that felt real. And who held on to that, completely, openly, at the cost of everything, because he had been taught since childhood that total devotion was the only kind worth giving. He was not a monster who got what he deserved. He was a boy who never had a choice about being placed in an impossible position, and made the mistake of being exactly who he was inside it. Rome killed him for that. Then spent 1800 years making sure you'd think he deserved it. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Not, was Elagabalus good or bad? That is too simple for what this story actually is. The question is this. Every emperor who came before him, the ones who murdered and burned and tortured and are still studied respectfully in universities, they all performed the role Rome needed. They dominated. They conquered. They projected the image of power that the system required to function. Elagabalus refused. Not through weakness. Not through incompetence. Through complete, defiant, 18-year-old certainty that he was not going to be something he wasn't. And Rome, the most powerful civilization the ancient world had ever produced, could not handle it. So here is what I am actually asking you. When a system built on dominance destroys the one person inside it who refuses to dominate, who is the monster? Rome threw his body in the Tiber. But you are still here. Still watching. Still asking questions about a boy they tried to make disappear. 1800 years later, he's still here too.